He laughed. Right there, in the middle of the courtroom, with his badge gleaming and confidence dripping from every word, he laughed, not out of amusement, but out of disdain. That laugh, cruel and cutting, wasn't just about the case or the evidence. It was about her. A young, black woman, freshly sworn in, standing proud in her cheap suit and second-hand briefcase, daring to walk into his world. A courtroom in a town where people like her were seen, but never truly heard. She wasn't just arguing a case, she was challenging a system. And that laugh? It told her exactly what that system thought of her. "You're out of your league, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "This ain't no TV show. You think you're gonna outsmart a decorated officer in front of this jury? Good luck with that." The room chuckled with him. Even the judge smirked. To them, it was a performance. A formality. She was a formality. No one expected her to do more than stumble through her arguments and lose. Maybe even cry if she was lucky. She was supposed to be intimidated, embarrassed, silenced. And for a moment, they almost got what they wanted. Almost. But what none of them knew, what not even he suspected, was that she had spent her entire life preparing for that moment. Not for that specific case, but for that moment of humiliation. That room. That stare. That smirk. That laugh. She had heard it before, in different forms, in different voices. From teachers who doubted her, from neighbors who whispered, from recruiters who said she didn't look the part. She had built herself from the ashes of those insults. This wasn't new. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Because that courtroom was sitting on a lie. A lie that man in uniform had carefully constructed, one of many. A lie that was about to unravel in ways no one could imagine. She didn't just walk in with legal textbooks and a bar license. She walked in with receipts. Evidence. Truth. And beneath that calm, poised demeanor was fire. A burning drive not just to win, but to expose everything they thought was buried. Everything they laughed about behind closed doors. Everything he had done to people like her, thinking no one would ever have the power to speak up. Until now. The case looked simple from the outside. Another young black man accused of a crime that made headlines but lacked depth. The officer claimed he caught him red-handed. Said he ran. Said he looked guilty. Said it all added up. But she had already noticed the cracks. The inconsistencies. The timing. The camera that wasn't working that day. The evidence that was suddenly misplaced. The testimonies that didn't align. And she knew, deep down, in her gut, the same gut that helped her survive every injustice life had thrown her way, that this case was more than just false accusations. It was a pattern. A strategy. A weapon used to silence, to control, to erase. She started to dig. Quietly at first. Observing. Listening. Asking questions that made the officer shift in his seat. Pulling records. Finding names. Victims. Stories that matched. Too many to be coincidence. She stayed up for nights connecting the dots. Alone. Because no one else believed in the possibility that a cop like him, respected, praised, protected, could be at the center of something so corrupt, so methodical. But she believed. Because she knew. Still, nothing prepared her for what she found. It went deeper than expected. This wasn't just one bad cop. This was a network. A system built to feed on fear, on stereotypes, on silence. And he was at the center of it. He wasn't just laughing at her. He was mocking every life he'd destroyed. Every case he'd twisted. Every right he'd trampled. And when she stood up again, that second day in court, her hands no longer shook. She looked him dead in the eye. No notes. No hesitations. And as she laid out her arguments, thread by thread, she didn't just talk to the judge or the jury. She talked to the entire city. She told the story no one dared to tell. She opened the door to secrets that were supposed to stay hidden. She forced the room to look at the truth they had ignored for years. But she was just getting started. Because she had one last move. One piece of evidence that would shift everything. One discovery that not only proved her client's innocence, but tied the officer to a long string of fabricated arrests, planted evidence, and coerced testimonies. And when she reveals it, nothing, absolutely nothing, will ever be the same. What happens when the person you trusted to protect the law is the one breaking it behind closed doors? What happens when the one underestimated becomes the biggest threat to a corrupt system? What happens when she wins? Stick around. You're going to want to hear how this ends. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We see you. We hear you. And your story matters. The strength, resilience, and brilliance of the black community inspire every story we tell here. This channel is a safe space, and we will always use this platform to elevate truth, justice, and powerful voices that deserve to be heard. Now sit back, because what you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a statement. Make sure to subscribe and hit that like button if you believe in stories that fight back. Enjoy the twist. Her name was Amara Johnson, and from the moment she stepped into the courthouse in Greenville, Mississippi, it was clear that the odds were stacked against her. She was 26 years old, the youngest public defender in the district, and one of the only black women practicing law in a courtroom that still echoed with the weight of its deeply segregated past. She didn't come from a family of lawyers or politicians. She didn't have a powerful last name or a mentor with influence. What she had was grit. Unshakable grit that had carried her through every locked door, every backhanded compliment, every raised eyebrow, and every standardized test that wasn't built for someone like her. Her mother, Denise, had worked 2 jobs for over 20 years, raising Amara and her younger brother Darius alone, after their father was killed in an alleged routine traffic stop that no one in their community ever forgot, and that no one in the police department ever explained. That memory shaped Amara, not as a trauma to be buried, but as a fuel that never ran out. Greenville wasn't the kind of place where justice evolved easily. The courthouse still bore the name of a Confederate general, and the bench was occupied by Judge Edwin Cartwright, a man who had worn his biases like a second robe for over 3 decades. His voice never needed to be raised. His words alone could ice the room. And although he was careful never to say anything overt, the silence after his smirk said enough. The prosecutors in Greenville weren't known for their thoroughness or fairness, but for their conviction rates. And that, more than truth, had become the currency of justice in that town. Then there was Officer Blake Whitaker. A man with 20 years in the Greenville Police Department and a spotless record on paper, but only on paper. To the public, he was a model officer, decorated and always quoted in local news as a pillar of law and order. To the black residents of Greenville, he was something else entirely. His name came up in whispers, usually late at night, usually when someone's son had been stopped without reason or someone's cousin had been booked for resisting arrest without having committed any crime at all. Nothing ever stuck to him. Every internal investigation was buried. Every witness recanted. Every protest fizzled out. And he knew it. He moved through the streets like a man above the law, with the kind of smirk that made people feel like speaking out would cost them more than staying silent. Amara had seen him before, on the news, in reports, in stories shared by neighbors and friends. But standing face to face with him in a courtroom, that was different. The case was supposed to be small. A young man, Jamal Thompson, was caught near the scene of a break-in at a liquor store. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Just a police report and an anonymous tip. Blake Whitaker made the arrest. Claimed he saw Jamal run out of the alley behind the store. Claimed the suspect matched the description. But the description, Amara noticed immediately, was so vague it could have matched half the teenage boys in Greenville. Black hoodie, jeans, running. That was it. No ID on Jamal. No stolen goods. Just matched the description and ran when approached. It was the kind of case that usually disappeared into plea deals and overworked court-appointed attorneys. But not this time. Jamal's mother had insisted on fighting. And that's how Amara got involved. When she met Jamal, he was terrified. Not of the sentence, though he faced up to 5 years if convicted, but of Blake Whitaker. He kept looking at me like he already knew I was guilty, Jamal said quietly. Like he already won. Amara spent her first week digging. Asking questions. Visiting the scene. Reviewing the arrest timeline. Every little thing chipped away at the story, but nothing definitive. Whitaker's report was too clean, too practiced. His body cam had been mysteriously malfunctioning. The store's security camera had conveniently been under repair. There were no other officers present, and no one from the neighborhood wanted to speak on the record. Fear hung in the air like smoke. She could feel it in every conversation cut short, in every window that closed when she walked by with her notepad. Still, she refused to back down. She stayed up late in the small office she shared with 2 other defenders, going over documents, comparing timelines, looking for a crack. What she lacked in resources, she made up for in persistence. But every time she walked into the courtroom, the energy shifted. The prosecutors rolled their eyes. Judge Cartwright barely looked up. And Blake Whitaker. Blake smirked. Every single time. He sat in the witness box like he owned the place, legs relaxed, arms folded, speaking with that false humility that only people in power have perfected. When asked to recount the events, he leaned forward and said things like, "I've been doing this job a long time. I know when someone's up to no good." And when Amara objected, he looked at her, not the judge, not the jury, but her, and said with a chuckle, "Don't worry, ma'am. I'll keep it simple for you." The laughter from the courtroom wasn't loud, but it was there. It was enough. Enough to burn. Enough to remind her of every time someone doubted her, not because of her logic or preparation, but because of the way she looked. She stood there in silence, holding her pen a little tighter, her knuckles whitening around it. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But inside, something hardened. Not out of anger, but clarity. That was the moment she stopped treating this as just a case. It became personal. Outside of court, life wasn't easier. Her apartment was small, barely furnished, with boxes she never had time to unpack. Her fridge was half empty, her student loans overwhelming. She didn't have a partner to vent to at night or a mentor to lean on. Her phone calls to her mother were short and often ended with both of them pretending not to worry about each other. But none of that made her weaker. It made her sharper. Every difficulty was a reminder of what was at stake. What failure would cost. As the trial continued, Amara began to notice things. Blake always showed up early. Always sat in the same seat. Always wore the same smug expression. But he avoided certain questions. Dodged specific details. He got defensive when timelines were brought up. And that's when she started to realize, he was confident, yes. But maybe, not untouchable. Maybe, just maybe, there was something there. A pattern. A history. A crack waiting to be split wide open. The jury watched quietly. The courtroom remained cold. And Blake Whitaker? He laughed less. Not a lot less. But enough for her to notice. Enough for her to know she was getting closer to something he didn't want revealed. And what she would uncover next wouldn't just change the outcome of Jamal's case. It would shake the entire foundation of Greenville's justice system. But was the truth powerful enough to bring down a man like Blake Whitaker? And could Amara, armed with nothing but her voice, her mind, and her resolve, stand against a system that had never once welcomed someone like her? The answer was coming. But no one, especially not Blake, was ready for what was about to be revealed. The second week of the trial began with a thickness in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the heat pressing against the tall windows of the courtroom or the stale tension that had become a familiar shadow in every proceeding. It was something else, something tighter, more electric. Amara could feel it every time she walked into the building. People looked at her differently. Some with curiosity, others with suspicion, and a few with a flicker of unexpected respect. Her quiet persistence had started to shift the atmosphere. Slowly. Imperceptibly. But shift it had. She wasn't the rookie anymore. She was the woman who didn't back down. And though no one said it aloud, they were starting to watch her a little more closely now, not to laugh, but to see what she would do next. The prosecution kept things simple, almost too simple. Testimony after testimony leaned heavily on Officer Whitaker's credibility. They painted Jamal as a troubled youth, someone with a history of loitering and attitude problems, as if those were crimes in themselves. Amara listened in silence, jotting notes, but more often watching Whitaker. He played his part perfectly. Calm. Professional. Polished. He gave short, decisive answers. Smiled when appropriate. Made eye contact with the jury. And every now and then, he glanced at her. Not long, not often, but with just enough smugness to remind her what he thought of her chances. That smirk hadn't vanished, it had simply learned how to wear a uniform. Amara's defense started to take shape not with dramatic revelations but with steady questions. She brought in a forensic analyst who quietly contradicted the timeline of the break-in. She asked a former store clerk why the security camera hadn't been working, and learned it had been fine until the day after the incident. She visited the alley behind the liquor store herself, twice, even in the dark, timing how long it would have taken someone to get from the supposed scene of the crime to where Jamal was found. Her cross-examinations were crisp, pointed, deliberate. No theatrics. Just facts. And every time she stood, she did so with the calm of someone who had nothing left to lose but her truth. Late one evening, she sat alone in her office, a pile of folders spread around her like the wings of a paper storm. She wasn't even reading anymore, just staring, drained, fighting the fatigue that came not just from lack of sleep but from constantly pushing against a wall that refused to budge. The door creaked. She didn't look up. "I know what he did," a voice said. She looked up slowly. A man stood there, nervously wringing his hands. His badge peeked out from the inside of his jacket, barely visible. His face was pale. Tired. Officer Terrence Malone. Younger than Whitaker. Not as confident. Not as silent. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "But I can't watch this anymore." Amara didn't move. She barely breathed. Just listened. "I was Whitaker's partner for 2 years," he continued. "I know how he works. I know what he's done. Not just with this kid. With others. Too many. He covers his tracks. Gets others to cover for him. It's all off the books. All in the shadows. But I've seen it." Her voice, when it came, was low. Measured. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I got a son," he said. "And one day, that boy's gonna grow up and maybe look like Jamal. And I won't be able to live with myself if I let this keep happening." They sat in silence for a moment. Just breathing. Just existing in the gravity of what he'd just said. "But you need more than my word," Malone finally added. "So I brought this." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and set it on her desk. "I wasn't always proud of what I did," he said. "So I started saving things. Recordings. Notes. Reports. Stuff that didn't add up. Amara stared at the flash drive like it was radioactive. Because it was. If what he said was true, it wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This could blow open everything. The next day, she didn't show her hand. Not yet. She needed time to verify. To analyze. To protect what she had. The courtroom carried on like usual. The judge made dry remarks. The prosecution presented their final witnesses. Whitaker recited his lines with the same steady ease. But Amara wasn't watching the witnesses anymore. She was watching the system react. Small things. Side glances. Nervous whispers. People beginning to realize something was shifting. Outside the courthouse, the pressure built. Word got around that Amara had something. No one knew what. Just that something big was coming. She got phone calls at night. Hang-ups. A note left on her windshield that simply read, "Stop digging." But she didn't stop. She doubled down. She met with an investigative journalist she trusted. She handed over redacted versions of the files. She created backups. Left instructions with friends in case something happened to her. She wasn't being paranoid. She was being smart. Because she knew exactly how far people like Whitaker would go to stay protected. In court, she began to change her strategy. Her questions became sharper. She stopped reacting to Whitaker's smugness. She focused on planting seeds in the jury's mind. Seeds of doubt. Of inconsistency. Of patterns. She showed arrest records. Compared case files. Asked about missing footage. She asked the judge to compel the department to produce additional documents. The prosecution fought her at every step, but the pressure was rising. And the judge, slowly, started granting motions he never would have considered before. Then came the breaking point. Whitaker took the stand again, confident as ever. Amara stood before him, holding a folder. Her voice steady. Her eyes locked on his. "Officer Whitaker, are you aware of any internal complaints filed against you over the past 10 years? He smirked, eyes flicking toward the jury. None that were substantiated. "Interesting," she said, opening the folder. "Because we have reason to believe otherwise." A murmur swept through the room. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Johnson, are you presenting new evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said calmly. "But I'd prefer to do so after verifying the full scope of what we've uncovered. However, we believe Officer Whitaker's credibility is now a central issue in this case." Whitaker's smirk faded, just slightly. The judge hesitated. "You'll have your time, Ms. Johnson. Make it count." She nodded, closed the folder, and sat back down. The courtroom felt different after that. Quieter. Tenser. Like everyone was holding their breath. And still, she hadn't revealed what she knew. Not yet. Because the moment she did, everything would change. Careers would end. Cases would be reopened. Lives would be upturned. And if she wasn't careful, hers could be one of them. But one thing was certain. The smirk on Blake Whitaker's face. It was about to disappear, for good. The final week of the trial opened with a strange quiet. Not silence, there were still footsteps echoing through the marble hallways, clerks rustling papers, voices low with routine, but something deeper. A hush of anticipation, like the courthouse was holding its breath. By now, everyone had heard the rumors. That something big was coming. That the young defense attorney wasn't just challenging a charge, she was about to crack something wide open. Even those who had dismissed her at first, those who had laughed, were beginning to sit straighter when she entered the courtroom. Amara Johnson no longer moved like someone unsure of her place. She walked with the unshakable calm of someone who had chosen to hold fire until the moment it would burn the brightest. That morning, she arrived earlier than usual, dressed in the same navy blue suit she'd worn on the first day. She walked through security with her head high, her step steady, and a worn leather bag clutched in her hand. Inside it was a folder. A flash drive. And a truth that had waited too long to be told. When the session began, Judge Cartwright leaned slightly forward, peering over his glasses. "Ms. Johnson, you indicated last session you had new evidence you wished to present. Are you ready to proceed?" She stood slowly, her fingers grazing the folder, her voice calm and precise. "Yes, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to call a rebuttal witness before introducing the documents into evidence." There was a pause. A ripple of murmurs. "Very well," the judge replied. "Who is your witness?" She turned toward the door as it opened. Officer Terrence Malone stepped in. Uniform traded for a plain black jacket, his expression solemn. He walked with the weight of someone who knew the next hour might cost him everything. But he walked forward anyway. The prosecution objected almost immediately. "Your Honor, this witness was not on the defense's list." Judge Cartwright raised a hand. "Let her speak. I want to hear this." Amara nodded once and turned to Malone. "Officer Malone, do you recall the night of September 12th? The night my client was arrested?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. I wasn't on duty. But I remember it." "Were you informed about the incident afterward?" "I was," he said. "Officer Whitaker mentioned it in passing. Said it was clean work." Amara paced slowly. "Clean work. Did that strike you as a strange comment?" Malone looked at the jury, then back at her. "It did. Because I've heard him say that before. And I've learned it means something else." She walked over to her desk, pulled the flash drive from her bag, and held it up. "Officer Malone, could you explain to the court what's on this device?" He swallowed hard. "It contains audio recordings. Notes I took. Internal memos. Things I copied from department records. It shows a pattern. Arrests made with no probable cause. Evidence misplaced. Cameras malfunctioning on nights Officer Whitaker made arrests. Statements edited or coerced. It's extensive." Gasps swept across the room. Amara didn't react. She stayed locked in, eyes on the witness. "Did you ever report this to Internal Affairs?" "I did. Twice. Both reports were closed within a week. No action taken." "And why didn't you come forward sooner?" He hesitated, voice thick. "Fear. And shame." Amara stepped closer. Her voice dropped. "Shame for what?" "For being part of it. For looking the other way." The courtroom went still. The jury's eyes followed her every step now. Amara turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, I request that the evidence contained in this drive be admitted into the record. I also have printed documentation verifying chain of custody for the files, timestamps, and metadata." Judge Cartwright looked at her, long and hard, then nodded slowly. "Submit it." She handed the drive to the bailiff, then turned back to Whitaker. Still seated at the prosecution's table, his jaw was tight. His posture too still. The smirk was gone. "Officer Whitaker," she said, voice cutting through the silence, "you testified that you apprehended my client after identifying him running from the scene. You submitted a report stating that you recovered no evidence from the scene tying him to the crime, but that your instincts were correct, based on behavior. Is that accurate?" Whitaker's voice was stiff. "Yes." "Is it also true that your body cam was not functioning that night?" "There was a malfunction." "Again?" she asked, tilting her head. "According to these records, your body cam has been malfunctioning on 14 separate incidents in the past 2 years. Is that common, officer?" "I don't maintain the equipment," he said through clenched teeth. She smiled. "Fair. But you do benefit from its absence." The judge intervened. "Ms. Johnson. "Of course, Your Honor," she said quickly, then turned back to Whitaker. "Let's talk about the timeline. You claim the suspect ran from the alley. But according to this time-stamped report, you logged the suspect's identity into the system a full 6 minutes before the alleged arrest took place. How do you explain that?" Whitaker faltered. "It must have been a clerical error." Amara stepped closer. "And how about this? A video, quietly recorded by a store clerk, shows you speaking to Jamal calmly outside the alley. Not chasing him. Not apprehending him. Just standing with him. Hands on your hips. Then leading him to your car without resistance. How does that fit with your statement that he ran when approached?" He didn't answer. She pressed on. "Were you trying to make another, clean arrest, that night? Another number to boost your record? Another statistic to fill a quota?" "Objection," the prosecutor barked. "Speculation, sustained," the judge said, but his voice was lower now. Less certain. Amara turned to the jury, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Then she looked back at Whitaker and said softly, "You knew no one would question you. Because they never have. You thought you were untouchable. But the truth always finds a way. Even in places like this." She let those words settle. Then walked back to her table and sat. The courtroom was different now. The jury leaned forward in their seats. The judge kept stealing glances at the files in front of him. The prosecution whispered furiously. And Officer Blake Whitaker, once the picture of confidence, now stared blankly ahead, lips pressed into a hard line, as if holding something back. His empire of silence, of smirks and manipulations, was cracking. And the truth? It was only just beginning to pour through. But the question wasn't just whether Whitaker would fall. It was how many others he'd take down with him. The weight in the room became unbearable as soon as the video was played. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was quiet, even routine, but it was damning. On screen, Officer Blake Whitaker stood beside a young black man, Jamal Thompson, in the alley behind the liquor store. There was no chase. No confrontation. No sudden movement or signs of resistance. Just two people, standing. Whitaker, arms crossed, appeared to be speaking calmly, then motioned for Jamal to follow him to the squad car. Jamal went willingly. No cuffs. No struggle. Just compliance. And then, when the camera panned slightly, the time stamp flashed clearly, several minutes after the officer had logged the arrest into the system. The same arrest that, according to his sworn testimony, had only occurred following a foot pursuit. The courtroom remained silent after the video ended, but the silence was no longer passive, it was suffocating. It hung over every head like a storm cloud ready to break. The jury didn't look at Amara anymore. They looked at him. At Whitaker. And his face, once carefully measured, now bore the unmistakable trace of fear. Judge Cartwright adjusted his glasses, leaning slightly forward. "Officer Whitaker, you've just seen a recording that contradicts your sworn testimony. Do you have an explanation for the court?" Whitaker cleared his throat, but no sound came. He looked at the prosecutor, at the judge, then at Amara, and for the first time, there was no smirk. Just silence. His lawyer began to speak, but Cartwright raised his hand sharply. "Officer Whitaker will respond for himself." After a long pause, Whitaker finally said, "That video is, out of context. It doesn't show everything." Amara stood slowly, her voice low but unyielding. "It shows enough." He shot her a look, sharp and bitter, but said nothing. "Your Honor," she continued, "in light of this evidence, the defense moves to have the charges against Mr. Thompson dismissed, and we formally request that the court open a motion for perjury and obstruction of justice against Officer Whitaker." The prosecutor rose to object, but even she knew it was too late. The room was shifting, and the ground beneath her client's case had just given way completely. Judge Cartwright sat back in his chair, the wheels clearly turning behind his expressionless face. This court will recess for 30 minutes while I review the material further and make a formal ruling. Everyone remain available. As the judge stood and exited through the door behind the bench, the courtroom erupted, not in noise, but in motion. Lawyers whispered, reporters rushed to their phones, and the jury exchanged stunned glances. The bailiff approached Whitaker, quietly escorting him out through a side door. Not in handcuffs. Not yet. But different now. Exposed. Amara didn't move. She sat at her table, shoulders still, hands folded. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. Her face remained calm, but inside, her pulse was wild. Her stomach twisted. Not from fear anymore, but from something heavier. The weight of vindication, yes, but also the knowledge of just how deep the damage went. This wasn't one lie. This was years of lies. Decades of silence. And as she stared at the empty space where Whitaker had been, she felt the reality settling in. This was only the beginning. Jamal's mother stood slowly from the bench, tears welling in her eyes. She stepped forward, and for a moment, it looked like she might speak, but instead, she just reached for Amara's hand and held it. No words. Just pressure. The gratitude of a mother who had feared for her son's future and now saw, for the first time, a path back to hope. Outside the courtroom, the air was different. News vans lined the streets. People gathered on the steps. Rumors flew like birds released from a cage. And when Amara stepped out into the sunlight, reporters rushed her, microphones extended, questions shouted. She paused only for a moment, then raised her voice just loud enough for all of them to hear. This isn't just about one man or one case. This is about a system that protects power and punishes truth. But we are not done. We are just getting started. Then she walked straight through the crowd, her chin lifted, her face calm. 30 minutes later, the courtroom reconvened. Judge Cartwright returned, his face grave. The murmurs faded as he adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. This court has reviewed the evidence submitted by the defense, including the video footage and supporting documentation provided by Officer Malone. The discrepancies between the officer's report, sworn testimony, and the footage presented cannot be ignored. As such, the charges against Mr. Thompson are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court is recommending an immediate inquiry into the conduct of Officer Blake Whitaker, including potential charges of perjury, evidence tampering, and violation of civil rights. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Amara didn't flinch. The judge continued. Let this serve as a reminder. The law is not owned by any one person. It is not the property of those in uniform or those in robes. It belongs to the people. And it is our duty to protect it, not with words, but with actions. He stood, tapped his gavel, and left the bench. The room broke into chaos. Reporters whispered frantically into phones. Court officers moved with urgency. Jamal stood frozen, still processing the words. Amara turned to him, her voice gentle. You're free, she said. You're going home. He didn't respond right away. Then he nodded, slowly. Thank you. Outside, the temperature had dropped slightly, a breeze pushing through the trees that lined the courthouse lawn. Amara walked beside Jamal and his mother, past the crowd, past the news cameras, past the whispers. Her heart beat quietly in her chest. Not triumphant. Just steady. As they reached the parking lot, a voice called out from behind. Ms. Johnson. She turned. Officer Malone stood there, still wearing that haunted look. I just wanted to say. I'm sorry. For everything. She studied him, searching his face. Then make sure it doesn't happen again, she said. Not to anyone else. He nodded. I will. And then he left. Amara stood in the middle of the lot, surrounded by the buzz of a world that was only just starting to wake up. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let the breeze pass over her skin. She had walked into that courtroom alone, armed only with her belief in what was right, and now the system had listened. Maybe not completely. Maybe not forever. But enough. Enough for today. But even as she exhaled, she knew this wasn't over. Whitaker wasn't the only one. There would be others. More trials. More battles. But she would be ready. Because the system had counted on her silence. And they had no idea what they had unleashed. The courthouse that once seemed to loom like a fortress now felt smaller, stripped of its illusion of invincibility. Word had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the trial. Local news outlets ran headlines that bordered on disbelief. Social media caught fire with videos and clips of Amara's cross-examination, her composure, the calm power in her voice as she dismantled a decorated officer's testimony brick by brick. But inside Amara's chest, the storm hadn't settled. The case may have been dismissed, but the damage it uncovered ran deep and wide, and for every cheer outside, there was a weight that settled heavier on her shoulders. Because now everyone expected her to keep going, to fix what she had barely begun to expose. In the days that followed, the police department scrambled. A formal investigation was launched, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Amara had submitted a motion to unseal archived complaints tied to Whitaker, and more than a dozen came to light. Most were closed without follow-up, a few were marked unsubstantiated, and some were missing entirely from the digital record, existing only in whispered memories from families who never found justice. She knew now she had the power to dig deeper, but that power came with something she hadn't expected to face so soon: doubt. Late at night, alone in her apartment, Amara stared at her phone screen, reading anonymous threats sent to her inbox. "You'll regret this. You don't belong here. You think you're safe." They weren't original. Just variations of the same message she had heard her entire life. But what unsettled her most wasn't the words, it was the silence from the people who should have spoken up. The Bar Association hadn't reached out. Other public defenders stayed quiet, afraid to be pulled into the mess. And even Judge Cartwright, who had stood firm in court, remained invisible behind closed doors. The system had allowed her victory, but it hadn't welcomed it. Then came the offer. It was delivered in the form of a formal letter, crisp and well-written, signed by the district attorney herself. A job. Not as a public defender. As a prosecutor. A unique opportunity, the letter read, to bring real change from the inside. It came with a raise, benefits, and the promise of authority. Her mother would have been proud. Her classmates from law school would have called it a dream. But Amara stared at the paper with a growing sickness in her gut. The same office that had ignored her, belittled her, that had laughed with Whitaker in the halls, now wanted her to wear their badge. To call her victories theirs. She folded the letter neatly and set it aside. The next morning, she met with Jamal and his mother one last time. He had shaved, cleaned up, tried to smile, but the trauma still sat behind his eyes. They thanked her, over and over, but Amara could barely meet their gratitude without thinking of how many more Jamals were still behind bars, still being pulled into courtrooms with no cameras, no journalists, no defenders willing, or able, to fight for them. Jamal's release wasn't justice. It was mercy. And mercy wasn't enough. Her inbox flooded with requests. Families who had seen the trial and wanted her help. Reporters who wanted interviews. A university that invited her to speak on criminal justice reform. She was no longer invisible. But she had never sought visibility. She wanted change. And now, standing at the edge of what could be a career-defining moment, she found herself asking a question that shook her more than anything Whitaker had done. What if she wasn't ready? What if this world, the one where corruption was layered and protected, where power circled its wagons and erased the weak, was too big for her to fight alone? The only person she told this to was Officer Malone. They met in the back of a diner on the edge of town. He looked older already, like someone who had tasted the truth and found it too bitter to swallow whole. His hands trembled slightly as he sipped coffee, eyes darting to the windows like someone expecting punishment. When she told him about the prosecutor's offer, he didn't smile. "They don't want you to fix it," he said quietly. "They want to own the credit. Keep it looking like progress while nothing changes." She nodded. "So what do I do?" Malone hesitated. "The same thing I should have done a long time ago. Keep digging." He handed her a small folder. Inside were names. Badge numbers. Incidents. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start. "You think you're alone," he said, "but you're not. You just have to be loud enough that others stop pretending they can't hear." That night, Amara couldn't sleep. She walked the streets of Greenville, quiet now, almost serene. But behind every porch light and every cracked sidewalk was a story. A life changed. A record tainted. A future stolen. She knew now that Whitaker had been a symptom, not the disease. And even as he awaited a hearing, already suspended, possibly facing prison, the machine that had protected him continued to turn. She had pulled one thread, and the whole fabric had begun to tremble. But it hadn't unraveled. Not yet. The next morning, Amara walked into her office and opened a new file. She titled it Reform Initiative. She wasn't going to the prosecutor's office. She wasn't going to law school panels. She was staying right where she was. But now she was building something. A network. A coalition. She began contacting other defenders. Community leaders. Journalists who still believed in truth. She wanted more eyes, more voices, more weight behind every step she took. No one was coming to save the system. But maybe, just maybe, together they could rebuild it. That week, she received a subpoena. Not for a case. For herself. The Department of Justice had launched an inquiry into the Greenville Police Department. She was being called as a key witness. When she opened the envelope, her hands were steady. Change, she realized, didn't come in the courtroom alone. It came in whispers, in signatures, in files opened that were never meant to see daylight. It came when someone refused to back down after the cameras were gone. And deep down, she knew, this wasn't her end. This was her beginning. 2 weeks after the trial, the energy in Greenville was different. It wasn't louder, or more chaotic, in fact, on the surface, it seemed calm. But Amara felt it in the way people paused when they spoke to her now, in the subtle changes in body language, in the way some officers avoided her eyes and others watched her a little too closely. Her name had become a kind of warning. In some corners, she was the hero who stood up to a broken system. In others, she was the troublemaker who made everyone uncomfortable. But she hadn't come to be liked. She had come to fight, and now the battle was evolving. The courtroom victory was just the door, what came next would be harder, slower, and infinitely more dangerous. She sat across from Jamal one afternoon in a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. He had started working part-time with a local mechanic, trying to rebuild the pieces of a life interrupted by false accusations and time spent waiting for a justice that almost never came. His eyes still carried the weight of everything that had happened, and his voice was softer now, cautious. "I don't sleep much," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear those cuffs clicking. I know I'm free, but it still feels like I'm in it." Amara nodded, folding her hands on the table. "That doesn't go away overnight. What happened to you doesn't get erased because a judge says, dismissed. You were never supposed to be treated like that." He looked up, pain flickering behind his tired expression. "They could have ruined everything. If you hadn't believed me, I didn't just believe you," she said gently. "I knew you. I knew the system would try to make you into something you're not. Because I've seen it before. He hesitated, then asked the question she had been bracing for. Is Whitaker going to prison? Amara took a deep breath. He's under federal investigation now. The DOJ's reviewing all his past cases. Civil rights violations. Perjury. Tampering. It's serious. But it's going to take time. Jamal leaned back, his voice bitter. But he gets time. He gets process. I didn't get that. No, you didn't, she said quietly. And that's what I'm trying to change. As they parted ways, she watched him walk away, shoulders hunched slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight. She wondered how many others walked the same way every day in Greenville. How many names were lost in the files of forgotten arrests and unchallenged convictions. Back in her office, Amara met with the first two lawyers who had agreed to join her initiative. One was an older woman named Carla Torres, a former civil rights attorney who had returned to the South after years in D.C. The other was Marcus Bell, a sharp but disillusioned public defender who had been thinking of quitting before the Whitaker case reminded him why he had started in the first place. The three of them sat surrounded by boxes of documents, timelines, affidavits. Each page represented a life. A choice. A fracture in someone's history. I talked to a woman this morning, Carla said, flipping through a file. Her son was arrested 3 years ago by Whitaker. No record of it in the main database, but she has the paperwork. Says the charges just disappeared. No court date. Nothing. Marcus leaned forward, eyes narrowed. That's not a mistake. That's a cover-up. Amara nodded. We're going to need help. More than just us. I've reached out to the Innocence Project, and there's a journalist from Atlanta who wants to look into the broader story. Carla gave her a look. You're putting a big target on your back. I know, Amara replied. But it's already there. Might as well make it count. That night, she received a call. Unknown number. A man's voice on the other end. Calm. Cold. You should stop while you're ahead. This town has a way of eating people like you alive. She didn't say anything. She just ended the call, then turned off her phone and placed it face down on her desk. She stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights humming softly. She felt a familiar weight in her chest, not fear, exactly. Not anymore. It was something else. The realization that justice wasn't a moment, it was a war. And each victory meant stepping further into the fire. The following week, she stood before the city council. The chamber was packed. News crews in the back, community members lining the walls. Some had come to support her. Others had come to defend the police. She knew this would be the hardest room to stand in. But she stood anyway. She presented her findings. Data. Testimonies. A clear pattern of misconduct. And then she looked each council member in the eye and said what no one else had dared to say. Accountability is not anti-police. It's pro-community. If we allow bad officers to stay in power, we are not protecting this city. We are destroying it from the inside. A man in the back shouted, "You're making this all about race." She turned to him, voice steady. This is about race. And power. And silence. And I won't be quiet just because the truth is uncomfortable. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, an older black woman approached her. Her eyes were filled with tears. My grandson, she said. They got him last year. Said he matched a description. He's been locked up ever since. No trial. No lawyer who would fight. Amara placed a hand on her shoulder. Give me his name. We'll look into it. And so it went. Every day, more files. More names. More voices. And through it all, Amara kept going, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had learned that fear was not a reason to stop. It was a reason to push harder. One night, as she sat surrounded by boxes in her dim office, her mother called. They hadn't spoken much since the trial. Denise's voice was quiet on the line, almost hesitant. "I saw you on the news," she said. "You looked strong. Like your daddy." Amara didn't respond right away. Her throat tightened. Finally, she whispered, "I hope he'd be proud." "He would be," Denise replied. "But I need you to be safe. Don't carry it all alone." "I'm not," Amara said. "Not anymore." She hung up and looked around at the stacks of paper, the notes scribbled in margins, the evidence of a fight bigger than one courtroom. The system she was up against was old and cunning and brutal, but she had something it didn't. She had the truth. And now, she had a movement. There was one file she hadn't opened yet. It sat at the bottom of the stack, heavier than the others. Whitaker's full disciplinary record, recently released under a court order. She opened it slowly, scanning through the pages. There it was, an incident from 15 years ago. A boy injured during a traffic stop. No charges filed. The officer involved, Blake Whitaker. The boy's name, Darius Johnson. Her brother. She stared at the name, her mind racing. She hadn't known. He'd never told her. But she remembered now, the limp he had as a teenager, the way he avoided police cars, the night he came home silent and bruised and never said a word. Her stomach churned. This had never been about one case. This had always been personal. They had touched her family, and she hadn't even known. But now she did. And nothing would stop her. The folder lay open on the edge of her desk, its contents quietly suffocating the air in the room. Amara sat frozen, eyes fixed on the name printed in the incident report. Darius Johnson. Her brother. 15 years ago, listed as a minor, injured during an altercation, with no charges filed and no medical report attached. The officer listed, Blake Whitaker. Her stomach twisted with a sharpness she hadn't felt since law school, since the night she cried herself to sleep reading case after case of young black men swallowed whole by a system that refused to see them as human. But this was her blood. Her family. Her foundation. And now, the lines between justice and vengeance, between duty and personal fire, blurred in ways she wasn't ready for. She called him that night. Darius answered after the second ring, his voice familiar and warm in a way only brothers could sound. "Hey, sis. Everything good?" Her throat tightened. "You never told me." A pause. "Told you what?" "About Whitaker. About that night." Silence stretched over the line like a slow storm cloud. "I didn't want you to carry that," he said finally. "You already had so much on your back. Mom was working double shifts. You were locked into school. I didn't want to drag you into it." "You didn't drag me into anything," she said, voice rising before she caught herself. "They did. And I should have known. I should have asked." "I tried to forget," he said. "I told myself it was just one of those things. Wrong place, wrong time. That's what everybody said. Even the hospital guy. But I never forgot his face. Never forgot his voice." Her hand trembled slightly as she held the phone. "You didn't just survive it. You buried it. Alone." "I had no choice," he said. "But you're doing something about it. You're not letting them keep writing these stories without pushback. That means more than you know." Amara sat back, staring at the ceiling as if it held some kind of answer. "I don't know what's fueling me anymore, Darius. Some days it feels like purpose. Other days, like rage. It can be both," he said, quietly. "Doesn't make it less right." The next morning, she stood before the mirror, adjusting her collar, brushing her edges with the same precision she had since law school. But now her reflection stared back at her with something deeper. Not confidence. Not even calm. It was resolve. A kind of heavy, unshakable truth wrapped around every inch of her like armor. She couldn't change the past. But she could make sure the system that wounded her brother didn't keep doing it to others. At City Hall, the pressure continued to build. More stories surfaced: an exonerated man in his 50s who had lost 20 years of his life to a fabricated charge, a teenage girl traumatized after a wrongful arrest, a mother who had died waiting for a hearing that never came. The community was beginning to organize, and Amara found herself at the center of it, not by design, but by necessity. People came to her office not just for legal advice, but for hope. And with every conversation, every name scribbled on a yellow legal pad, she felt the weight grow. The system was too vast to fix overnight, but now, finally, it was listening. Even if only out of fear. The district attorney called again. This time, she didn't send a letter. She showed up in person, walking into Amara's office with a forced smile and a tone just shy of condescending. "You've made quite the name for yourself," she said, glancing around the small, overworked space. "Thought it was time we had a real conversation." Amara raised an eyebrow, standing calmly. "We've already had one. You tried to offer me a job. I declined." "This is different," the DA said. "There's pressure now. From the public. From the state. They want oversight. Reform. We can't ignore it anymore. So we're putting together a task force. Civil rights attorneys, investigators, policy experts. We want you on it. Leading it." Amara paused. It was tempting. It sounded powerful. It sounded official. But she knew better. "You want to use my credibility to cover your inaction," she said flatly. "You want to stamp a reform label on this and keep the core intact." The DA didn't flinch. "We need someone like you to keep it from burning down." "It should burn down," Amara replied. "And we should build something honest from the ashes." "Careful," the DA said, her voice sharpening. "You're not invincible." "I don't need to be," Amara said. "I just need to be loud enough that you can't silence me without making the world watch." After she left, Amara sat at her desk and exhaled, long and slow. She wasn't interested in deals. Not anymore. She wanted transparency. She wanted a council that couldn't be bought, a review board that didn't answer to the police, policies that protected people before power. She wanted to pull out the roots, not trim the leaves. Later that night, she met with Carla and Marcus in a dimly lit church basement where members of the community had begun gathering weekly. They shared stories, traded resources, and quietly mapped out ways to support victims of police abuse. There were no suits here, no microphones, just raw truth and a shared hunger for change. "We've got people ready to speak publicly," Marcus said. "Former inmates, former officers, even a retired judge. They're scared, but they're angry too." "Then we keep pushing," Amara said. "We build a case for the public. A story so clear they can't turn away. One that forces policy. Forces resignations. Forces truth." Carla looked at her carefully. "And you? What do you want?" Amara hesitated. She thought of Darius. Of her mother. Of that courtroom. Of the boy who could have died in an alley if no one had questioned the report. Her voice was soft, but sure. "I want accountability. And I want peace. But we don't get the second until we win the first." The days passed quickly after that. Meetings, depositions, late nights reviewing documents until her eyes burned. The DOJ inquiry had expanded into a broader investigation, and federal agents now walked the same halls where officers once laughed at her behind her back. Whitaker had been formally indicted. The charges were serious: civil rights violations, perjury, falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice. The trial date was set. And Amara would be testifying. The night before her deposition, she walked the path home she had taken so many times before, passing familiar street corners that now looked different in the shadow of all that had happened. A teenager rode by on his bike, headphones in, lost in his own world. She paused and watched him disappear into the distance, wondering what kind of city he'd grow up in. Whether it would protect him or hunt him. Whether it would listen to his voice or erase it. When she got home, she sat on her porch, the folder with Darius's name still sitting in her lap. She opened it again, reading every word with fresh eyes. She had spent her whole life chasing justice for strangers, never knowing it had lived in her own home, quietly surviving in silence. She called him again. "I want you to testify," she said. He didn't speak right away. "I don't need you to relive it. I just need them to hear you." He sighed. "I'm not like you, Amara. I don't speak like you. I don't know how to stand in front of all those people and be that strong." "You don't have to be me," she said. "You just have to be real. That's what they're afraid of." And after a long pause, he said quietly, "Then I'll do it." That night, Amara sat beneath the stars, eyes open, heart pounding. The battle had moved beyond her. It was now in the hands of a city awakening to its own reflection. But she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready. Because this time, when the truth was spoken, it would come not just from her voice, but from all the voices that had been ignored for far too long. The day of the federal trial arrived under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the mood of the city. There was no cheering crowd this time, no cameras shoved in her face, just a quiet line of people waiting to enter the courthouse, each one carrying the weight of a history that had finally begun to surface. Amara walked in beside her brother, Darius, who wore a suit for the first time since his graduation. His steps were slow, unsure, but his shoulders were square, his eyes focused. They didn't speak on the way inside. They didn't need to. What needed to be said had already passed between them in silence, in shared memories, in the pain of understanding just how deep the damage had gone. And yet, they were there. Together. The courtroom was smaller than the one she had battled in before, but the atmosphere was heavier. Federal agents filled the rows. Legal observers, press, other attorneys, all watching. The air buzzed with unspoken anticipation. Blake Whitaker sat at the defense table, older somehow, shrunken. Gone was the polished uniform, the confident posture. In its place was a man caught by the very rules he had once twisted to his will. He avoided Amara's eyes. He never once looked at Darius. When her brother took the stand, the room fell completely silent. His voice shook at first, but only slightly. He told the story not as a lawyer or an activist would, but as a brother, as a boy who had grown into a man carrying invisible scars. He spoke about the night that changed his view of the world, about the way he was pulled out of his car, the force used, the silence from those who were supposed to investigate. And when he said Whitaker's name, he didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He just said it plainly, truthfully, the way facts deserve to be spoken. Amara testified next. She spoke not of revenge, but of duty. Not of personal vendetta, but of structural injustice. She outlined the pattern, the cover-ups, the statistics that no longer seemed abstract because each one now had a face. She spoke of Jamal, of the others they'd discovered, and of how power had insulated itself for years behind procedures and red tape. And when she finished, she didn't look at the judge. She looked at the gallery, at the people who had waited their whole lives to see someone, anyone, be held accountable. The trial lasted only 3 days. The evidence was too overwhelming. The testimonies too compelling. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing was scheduled, but it hardly mattered to those who sat in that room. The acknowledgement alone, the admission that it had happened, that it was wrong, that it would no longer be protected, was a kind of justice they had never expected to see in their lifetimes. After the trial, Amara stood outside the courthouse beside Darius. The wind was sharp, but the sky had begun to clear. He turned to her, his voice quiet. "Thank you for not letting it go." She shook her head gently. "You don't thank someone for telling the truth. But you made them listen," he said. "You made it impossible for them not to." Jamal was there too, standing in the crowd. His life had changed. He was now working with a youth outreach program, speaking to kids who lived in the same neighborhoods he once feared walking through. He approached Amara and hugged her without a word. He didn't have to say anything. His life was proof enough of what had been reclaimed. Officer Terrence Malone resigned from the department weeks after the trial. He moved north, started working with an organization that trained officers in ethical policing and community engagement. He never tried to become a hero. But he never went silent again. Sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures, it comes in quiet decisions made every single day to be better than you were the day before. The city of Greenville underwent real changes. A civilian oversight board was established. Body cameras became mandatory with independent third-party monitoring. Prosecutors were no longer allowed to try cases involving officers they personally knew. And more importantly, people, especially black residents, began to believe that the system might, one day, serve them too. As for Amara, she declined every book deal, every TV appearance, every speaking gig that tried to spin her story into something neat and palatable. She kept practicing. She kept fighting. But now, she was building something even bigger. She founded a legal network that connected underserved communities with young black and brown lawyers who had the same fire she once carried alone. She mentored. She challenged. She remained uncompromising in her pursuit of equity, not popularity. Years later, a new attorney entered her office, nervous, eyes wide, full of questions. Amara sat across from her and smiled. "I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy," she said. "But if you know who you are, if you remember who you're doing it for, you'll never be alone." And that was the greatest victory of all. Not the courtroom win. Not the headlines. But the fact that the truth had outlived the lie. That a girl once laughed at by a corrupt officer in a dusty courtroom had built something so undeniable, so powerful, it forced the world to face itself. Now let me ask you this, how many Amaras have been silenced before they had the chance to speak? How many Darius still carry their stories in silence? How many Whitakers walk with impunity because the system has never been made to answer? This story isn't just about one trial, it's about all of us. About who we choose to be when we witness injustice. Do we stay silent? Or do we speak, even when our voices shake? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? What part of this story hit you the hardest? And most importantly, what can we all learn from it? If stories like this matter to you, if you believe in truth, justice, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that like button. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We change the ending.